Why are you mad, Brian?
Well, I'm not mad. I'm innocent, and I know I'm innocent. Sooner or later, they'll find out that it's true whenever I get to kill him.
Why did the two women in your life end up dead?
I don't know. You have to ask them.
You had nothing to do with either one?
The one that killed Julie.
Well, why is she in your basement, though?
Because I was in jail, and Julie was seeing him when I was in jail. He's the one that showed me where Julie was. If you don't believe I was in jail, all you gotta do is look at the records.
He had just been convicted of killing his wife. The courtroom was still echoing with the weight of that verdict. And then, barely 24 hours later, police made a second discovery. This time, they weren't in the woods. They were in the basement of his old house, digging through 2 feet of packed dirt. What they found wasn't supposed to be there. What they found could change everything we thought we knew about Brian Giles. Was this man hiding 2 murders all along? Or is this just the beginning of something far worse? It started in October of 2018. Nancy Giles, quiet, soft-spoken, and rarely seen without her husband, just stopped showing up. There was no big announcement. No tearful press conference. One day, she was simply gone. Her family grew worried almost immediately. Nancy wasn't the kind of person to vanish without a word. She didn't have a car. She didn't keep a phone. And according to loved ones, she wasn't even allowed to have one. Her husband, Brian Giles, told different people different things. To one person, Nancy had run off. To another, she was probably just laying low. But when the family pressed harder, really pushed him for answers, those stories didn't hold up. There were no signs of Nancy anywhere. No transactions. No calls. No messages. And if she had left voluntarily, why hadn't she told anyone? Why had she left everything behind? Behind the scenes, whispers started to circulate, about control, about isolation. People close to Nancy said Brian had a temper. He didn't like her talking to other people. He didn't like her leaving the house alone. Some said he didn't let her. That he monitored her. Eventually, the family had enough. They contacted the police. At first, it was treated like a missing persons case. But investigators quickly realized something didn't add up. Nancy's entire digital and physical footprint stopped cold in October. No travel records. No social media. No medical visits. No life. Nancy Giles had vanished. But the silence surrounding her disappearance? That was even louder. Long before Nancy disappeared, people had noticed things. Not all at once, but over time, in small pieces that didn't feel right. Neighbors remembered how Nancy seemed nervous around Brian. Quiet. Withdrawn. Almost like she was trying not to take up space. There were no police reports in the early days. No formal accusations. But those close to her described Brian as controlling. They said he was verbally abusive, that he raised his voice often, sometimes in public, and didn't seem to care who heard. It wasn't the kind of abuse you could easily document. No broken windows. Number 911 calls. Just a slow, persistent erosion of someone's confidence, and the fear that came with it. One thing stood out: Nancy didn't have a cell phone. Not because she lost it, or couldn't afford it, but because, according to witnesses, Brian wouldn't allow it. No way to call for help. No way to stay connected. No way to leave. And when she vanished in 2018, that isolation suddenly looked a lot more intentional. Police opened an investigation. But without a body, and without concrete evidence, their hands were tied. Suspicion wasn't enough to make an arrest. Not yet. But what they didn't know at the time, what nobody knew, was that Nancy wouldn't be the last woman to vanish after living with Brian Giles. 7 months after Nancy Giles vanished, it wasn't a police dog or a search team that found her. It was a man with a metal detector. He was scanning the hillside near the James Wood Sculpture Trail in Johnstown, an area that runs just below the city's historic inclined plane. It was quiet, tucked away, the kind of place people pass by without a second thought. But something in the dirt caught his attention. He dug just a little, and stopped. It didn't look like anything that belonged there. Police were called in. The area was sealed off. What began as a hobbyist's afternoon walk had just become a crime scene. Buried in a shallow grave were human remains. Not skeletonized, not decomposed beyond recognition. The body had been there for months, long enough to leave only fragments behind, but recent enough to preserve the story the bones were still telling. Forensic experts were brought in. They found trauma to the skull, fractures on both the front and back of the head. It wasn't natural. This was blunt force. The kind that doesn't happen by accident. Eventually, dental records confirmed what the family already feared. The body was Nancy Giles. She had been less than 2 miles from home. It wasn't until May 2022, 3.5 years after Nancy disappeared, that the first major step was taken in this case. For months, the police had been working in the background, quietly building their case. There were no grand breakthroughs, no sudden moments of clarity. But what they had were pieces, small pieces, each one leading them closer to the truth. Detectives spent months combing through digital records, mapping out a timeline of Nancy's last days. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have seen or heard something. They scoured her last known locations, hoping for that one tiny detail that could crack it wide open. But it wasn't just about finding clues, it was about finding the right clues. Giles had been telling people different stories about Nancy's disappearance. At first, it was that she left. Then, he said she'd run off with someone else. But every version had holes in it, inconsistencies that didn't line up with the facts. Forensic evidence gathered from the scene of her body's discovery in 2019 only deepened the suspicion. The blunt force trauma to her skull, the same kind of injury that wasn't an accident, was hard to ignore. But it wasn't until they cross-referenced this with the inconsistencies in Giles' statements that things started to fall into place. The community began to grow restless. It had been years without answers, and every passing day made the truth harder to find. Nancy's family pushed relentlessly for justice, demanding that the police take action. The local media kept the story alive, reminding everyone that this wasn't just another unsolved case. It was a life taken too soon, a woman who had been silenced. Still, the investigation moved slowly. There was no clear arrest. But the pieces of evidence, circumstantial as they were, started to form a troubling picture. Brian Giles was more involved than anyone had originally thought. And it wasn't until May of 2022, almost 4 years after Nancy's body had been found, that police finally had enough to make an arrest. The investigation had turned the corner, but not without a lot of time, effort, and patience. By June 2025, nearly 7 years had passed since Nancy Giles disappeared, and Brian Giles was finally standing trial for her murder. It was a long-awaited moment, one that had been delayed for years as the investigation unfolded piece by piece. But now, the time for answers had come. Prosecutors wasted no time in laying out their case. They didn't need a parade of direct witnesses to prove what had happened. What they had instead was something far more damning, a combination of physical evidence, forensic analysis, and the chilling pattern of behavior that had defined Brian's relationship with Nancy. One of the key points of the prosecution's case was the history of verbal and emotional abuse that Nancy had suffered. They presented testimony from neighbors and family members, all of whom had seen the toll Brian's controlling behavior had taken on Nancy. She had been isolated from her family, her friends, and even from basic communication. And while there were no direct witnesses to the moment Nancy's life was taken, it was clear that this abuse had been building for years, culminating in her tragic death. The forensic evidence was equally compelling. The blunt force trauma to Nancy's skull was not a random accident, it was intentional. The forensic experts tied this injury to Brian Giles, connecting it to the timeline of Nancy's disappearance and her eventual burial on the hillside near the inclined plane. It painted a devastating picture of a man who was more than capable of violence, and one who had the motive to silence his wife once and for all. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was Brian's own behavior. The lies. The contradictions. The strange mix of indifference and defensiveness in his public statements. Every version of his story seemed to shift, every detail seemed to move just slightly out of reach. He claimed Nancy left on her own, that she ran off, that she'd been seeing someone else. But none of these stories held up when compared with the reality of the evidence. By June 6, 2025, after a long and emotional trial, the jury had heard enough. Despite the lack of direct witnesses, the circumstantial evidence painted a clear picture. Brian Giles had murdered his wife, and no amount of excuses could change that. When the verdict came down, the courtroom held its breath. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. In that moment, Nancy's family finally had what they had been waiting for: justice. Just one day after Brian Giles was found guilty of murdering his wife, Nancy, something unexpected happened, a discovery that would shock everyone. On June 7, 2025, police received a tip, a report of a possible body located in the basement of Brian Giles' former home in the Kernville section of Johnstown. This was not just any tip, it was something that needed immediate attention. Authorities quickly responded, securing the property and preparing for what could be another grim chapter in this already tragic story. What they found when they began digging was nothing short of chilling. Beneath 2 to 3 feet of dirt, the excavation revealed human remains. A scene that was described as highly suspicious by local authorities. The discovery was unsettling not just because of its proximity to the already tragic events of Nancy's death, but because of the eerie silence that had surrounded the home in the years since. The body, however, was not immediately identified. Forensics were called in, and the scene was carefully processed. At first, there was little clarity. But as more details came to light, the implications became impossible to ignore. Police confirmed that the remains were found in the home where Brian's girlfriend, Jilly Tadero, had lived. Jilly had been reported missing in December 2020, over 4 years earlier, and her disappearance had remained unsolved ever since. Authorities had never been able to determine her whereabouts, despite efforts to investigate her sudden vanishing after a reported domestic altercation with Giles. The link between the remains and Jilly Tadero was still being confirmed, but the discovery left few questions. With Giles convicted of murdering his wife, and now a second body found under suspicious circumstances, investigators were beginning to connect the dots. What had seemed like a tragic coincidence now appeared to be part of a much darker pattern. What had happened to Jilly Tadero? And what did Brian Giles know about it? The discovery of the remains in Brian Giles' basement sent shockwaves through the community, but it raised even more questions, ones that had been lingering for years. In December 2020, Brian's girlfriend, Jilly Tadero, had vanished without a trace. Her disappearance came just days after a reported domestic altercation at the Kernville home where she had been living with Giles. No one knew exactly what happened, only that she was gone. At the time, there had been no formal charges filed. The situation was tragic but not immediately deemed suspicious. Jilly had simply disappeared, and with no body and few clues, the case quickly went cold. But now, in 2025, the unsettling discovery in the basement seemed to connect her disappearance to something far more sinister. Jilly had lived in that same house where police had now uncovered the remains. A house already tied to Brian Giles' violent past. Just like Nancy, she had been living with a man who had been known to be controlling, a man who had isolated his partners and shown signs of aggression. Was it possible that, like Nancy, Jilly had tried to leave, and paid the price for it? Now, the forensic team was tasked with identifying the remains found in Giles' basement. The body was sent to Massachusetts University for further examination. It would be a process that could take time, DNA tests, dental records, and other forensic methods to confirm the identity. But the thought was chilling. If the remains were indeed Jilly Tadero's, then Brian Giles may have been hiding 2 victims all along. The same man who had been convicted of murdering his wife might now be connected to the disappearance of a second woman. And the questions only multiplied. What had happened to Jilly? Had she fought to get away from Giles, just like Nancy had? Was this an act of revenge, or something darker, something that had been building for years? 2 women. 1 man. one convicted murder, one unidentified body. The story of Brian Giles is far from over, and the twists continue to unfold. But as we reflect on the evidence, what we know and what we don't, the questions linger. What if this wasn't just another case of domestic violence gone tragically wrong? What if, instead, it was something far more calculated? Something more sinister than we could have imagined? Could Brian Giles have been hiding his dark side, not just for a few years, but for much longer? Could he have been a predator, one who knew exactly how to manipulate those around him, keeping his victims isolated and under his control, only to discard them when they tried to break free? This is the chilling possibility that haunts this case. And it leads us to the most terrifying question of all. Is Brian Giles a serial predator? And if so, how long has he been getting away with it? As the investigation into Jilly Todero's disappearance deepens and more forensic evidence is uncovered, it's clear that we still don't know the full extent of the story. And that leaves us with a mystery that demands answers. What do you think? Could there be more victims? Or is Brian Giles just a man driven to violence by a tragic combination of circumstances? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates on this case and others like it.